So the gospel reading I've chosen this morning is from John chapter 1, verses 6 to 8 and verses 19 to 28. And they talk about John the Baptist being interrogated by the religious authorities when he began baptizing. It's actually, there's a typical story very like this with the Buddha. When the Buddha began his public ministry, he was interrogated by the priests because the Buddha didn't have a license to preach. He was a kshatriya, he wasn't a Brahmin. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. Now, this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, "I am not the Messiah." They asked him, "Then who are you? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Finally they said, "Who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, "I am a voice of one calling in the wilderness, make straight the way for the Lord." Then the Pharisees who had been sent asked, "Why then do you baptize if you are not the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" "I baptize with water," John replied, "but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie." This all happened at Bethany, on the other side of the Jordan, where John was baptizing. Words inspired by God. So the protocol has been for the last few months that I do a homily on 2 Sundays sequentially, and then the third Sunday I do a recap of the previous 2 homilies, and then we open it up to question and answers. So yesterday Lawrence sent out a synopsis of both homilies, the last 2, together with links to them, so you could refresh your memory if you wanted to look at them. So that's what I intend doing this morning. I'm going to do a quick recap of the homily of November 29th and the homily of December 6th. And then at the end of that, we're going to open it up to question and answers. So 2 Sundays ago, I gave a homily on, it was the first Sunday of Advent, and I was talking about the parable of Jesus, where he talks about a rich man going on a journey and setting his servants in charge of his property, and then coming back to find that a lot of them were asleep. And so that's what I talked about, coming fully awake, what it means to come fully awake. And if you remember, if you attended that homily, I started off with a story that happened to me roughly this time last year, where I'm on my way back from Palo Alto in Mass with COJ, and I'm coming up 280 in the middle lane of a 5-lane highway, just about to turn off to Brotherhood Way, and somebody jumped off the overpass right in front of me in lane 3. And I calculated subsequently, mathematically, that I literally had 1.25 seconds to miss this guy, which I managed to do. And I realized subsequently that I had never been more awake in my life than in that 1.25 seconds, when I had to make all these decisions about swerving to avoid him, getting back into the lane, stopping, phoning the police, and going back to try to attend to him. So in that period of time, I was more fully awake perhaps than I'd ever been, and time had totally slowed down. So I then went on to talk about being fully awake. What does it mean to be fully awake? And so what I did is I looked at this parable of Jesus, and the parable is simply that a man is going on safari for a long period of time, and he sets his servants in charge of all his property. Each of them has their own duties. And when he comes back, he finds that a lot of them are asleep. So he finishes the parable by saying, be watchful, be alert. You do not know when the master is coming back. And it seems like it's a real frightening time. And I opined that this actually, it's been written by Matthew around the year 70, and he's conflating a whole bunch of stuff right here. So is he talking about individual death when he says, be alert, you don't know when the master's coming back? Is he talking about individual death? Or is he actually talking about the fall of Jerusalem, which is happening as he's writing this gospel? Jerusalem fell after a 4-year siege by the Romans from 66 AD to 70, and it's been destroyed as he's writing this. So is he talking about the fall of Jerusalem? Or is he talking about the end of the world, that we don't know when the end of the entire world is going to happen, so be prepared? Or is he talking about the second coming of Jesus? The belief system was that Jesus was going to return imminently. And so Matthew is conflating these 4 things: individual death, the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the world, and the second coming of Jesus. So that's typically how this parable is unpacked. And I went on to suggest a different way of exegeting or unpacking this, because for me, it's a story about the amnesia for the mission. And I suggested that the master in this story, the rich man that comes back, at a time you don't expect, is not God. It's not about God. This is not a story about God coming back to surprise us and to give us the thumbs up or the thumbs down and send us to hell if we're asleep. It's the master is the soul attempting to wake us up during incarnation for the mission that we volunteered for. And so as I unpacked the parable, it went something like this. The man goes on his travels. What does that mean? It means the soul volunteering for incarnation. And we're told he leaves home. In other words, we leave source, we leave God, and we take on these spacesuits and we incarnate. That's what the journey is like. That's what it's like to leave home. And the soul puts servants in charge while it's away from home. And what are those servants? I suggested that they're the senses, perception, experience, and reality. And that's how we can navigate through incarnation. Our senses soak in data for us, and then this black box we carry between our ears processes that information. We call that perception. And then that leads to an experience of a phenomenon that we're witnessing. And then finally, that a lot of these experiences create our model of reality. And I used a metaphor from cooking. If you want to bake a blueberry pie, firstly, you need to assemble the ingredients. There would be the senses. The senses bring in the ingredients. And then the processing is you bake it. So that's the processing piece of it. Then the kind of experience is actually eating and tasting it. Yeah, and then the reality model is your verdict. How did it taste? Was it good or was it bad? Are you going to repeat that? So in some senses, these are the servants that the soul puts in charge of incarnation. And he says, finally, there's a gatekeeper who's supposed to keep watch. And the gatekeeper, obviously, is the ego. The gatekeeper is the CEO of waking consciousness. And it's meant to be a servant of the soul, but very often the ego behaves as if it's the master of everything. And so for me, this was a parable about waking up to the mission while we're incarnated. It's not about God coming back and punishing us for staying asleep. I made a second point in that homily, which I talked about. For me, Mother Mary is the exemplar par excellence of somebody who came fully awake to the mission, totally realizing what her job was, that she was to be the mother of the Mashiach, that she was to be Theotokos, God carrier. But I reminded you as well that, if God came to any one of us and said, how would you like to be the mother of God or the father of God? You'd say, oh, yeah, awesome, let's go for it. But there were caveats. And I think the angel Gabriel made her aware of it. He gave her a heads up. Here's what's going to happen. If you say yes to being the mother of the Messiah or to be a God carrier, here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to be regarded as an unmarried mother. You're betrothed to Joseph, but you're not married, and you're going to be pregnant, and people are going to judge you. Could be a lot of tongues wagging in the village of Nazareth. Moreover, this child that you're carrying, when he becomes a man, he's going to be regarded as crazy. Even his own family, your family are going to think he's crazy. And you find that story in Mark's Gospel in chapter 3, in verse 21 and in verse 31, where when Jesus began his public ministry, having been just a nice, quiet Jewish carpenter boy for 30 years, and now suddenly he's preaching and allegedly performing miracles, and his family were told, come to take him by force, because they thought he had flipped his lid, thought he was gone crazy. That's what your son is going to be like. And the story, Mary, is not going to have a happy ending, because eventually this child of yours whom you love will be humiliated and tortured and finally crucified by the Romans. So Do you still want to say yes to being the mother of this child? Now, very, very soon, Mary agrees. Okay, if that's what God wants me to do, that's what I will do. I have no idea how I'm going to deal with it, but I'm going to say yes. 40 days after the little child was born, they're presenting him in the temple in Jerusalem, Mary and Joseph, and two elderly people, Simeon and Anna, come and they take the child and they hug the child and they start prophesying. And then Simeon says something. He says, this child is destined for the fall and for the rise of many in Israel, so that the secret thoughts of many may be laid bare. And then he gave the child back to Mary and he said, and your own soul the sword shall pierce. So that's how she starts off motherhood, with this prophecy that her own soul is going to be pierced by a sword. So in spite of that, Mary continues to say yes. The third point I made on that Sunday was looking at what we do in incarnation, the price of incarnation for us humans. And I had the opinion that incarnation involves some version of what Mary had to go through for every single one of us. When you wake up to the realization that you too have agreed to be a mother of God, you have to accept that incarnation will also involve your soul being pierced by some kind of a sword. It'll be different for various people, but every one of us is going to experience incarnation as a sword through the heart at some stage. And so why then would we agree to incarnation? It's not because we're masochists and we're saying, sign me up for suffering, but rather that out of compassion, souls watching planet Earth from heaven and seeing the way that the world falls asleep and gets involved with all kinds of viciousness and warfare and greed, you put your hand up and you said, send me. I too want to birth God to the world. And I suggested that there is only one sin. You know, it's not breaking the 10 Commandments. It's not breaking the 6 commandments of the church. There's only one sin, I believe. It's the sin of staying asleep. It's the sin of refusing to wake up. And my opinion was then that we have to engage in serious spiritual practice in order to wake up. And I suggested maybe 5 particular practices that you have to actively work at replacing fear in your heart with love in your heart. You have to work seriously at replacing anxiety with trust that God and the universe will give you the resources you need to deal with whatever situations you find yourself in. You have to replace anger with compassion again and again and again for all different kinds of people and all different kinds of situations. You have to learn how to replace judgment with wisdom, real wisdom. Wisdom is memory shorn of the emotional baggage. That's what wisdom is. You control and harvest all of your memories as long as you let go of all the emotional baggage attached to your memories. And then finally, you have to substitute revenge with forgiveness. So that's where I went on the homily of 2 weeks ago. Last week on December 6th, the second Sunday of Advent, I wanted to look at the Rosary as a roadmap of spiritual evolution. And I started off with a story that happened to me as a young child, 4 years of age. I'm living with my grandparents and my great-grandmother, and we say the Rosary every night. And then there are trimmings at the end of the Rosary where you add on prayers of petition for various, causes. And as a small little 4-year-old child, I have no idea where it came from. I found myself saying aloud, please, Holy God, let the devil back into heaven. And there was a shocked silence, and my grandma says, the name of God Almighty, child, what are you saying? And then my great-grandmother jumped in and said, Francis, leave him alone. God knows exactly what he means. And I said, I didn't know what I meant myself. I didn't know whether I was just filled with extraordinary compassion so that I wanted even the devil to be forgiven, or whether I figured out that if the devil was left back into heaven, then Jesus and Mary and Joseph could keep an eye on him so he didn't do any damage while he was up there. And so I went on then to talk about the Rosary as a kind of a roadmap for spiritual evolution, and particularly the 5 joyful mysteries of the Rosary. Yeah, the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Nativity, the Presentation in the Temple, and the Finding in the Temple. And I unpacked those, according to my own insights, that in some senses, the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel historically would say to the Mary, this young woman, you have found favor with God, and God is asking you to be Theotokos, a God carrier. So I believe that That's true of Mary, obviously, but it's true of every single one of us, that there are two annunciations in the life of every soul. One is the annunciation before incarnation, and the other is an annunciation during incarnation. The annunciation before incarnation is that God said, I need volunteers to go down and to help the people who are blind and deaf and asleep. Who will volunteer? And you put your hand up and said, here I am, Lord, send me. That was the first annunciation. The annunciation that you are prepared to come down here, now, to be a sign of life and to give birth to God and our planet. And the second annunciation happens when you wake up during incarnation to that realization, because most of us are asleep at the wheel. But at some stage, hopefully, in everybody's incarnation, we'll realize why we're here, that we volunteered to be here now, to be Theotokos, to be a mother of God, a carrier of God. So that's what I meant by the Annunciation. The visitation is a story, you find it in Luke's Gospel in chapter 2, where this newly pregnant Mary finds out that her cousin Elizabeth, who's an old woman, also has conceived and is going to give birth to a child who will subsequently be known as John the Baptist, about whom we read today. And Mary sets out to the hill country of Judea to greet her cousin Elizabeth. Now, this is stage 2, because when you realize that you're a divine being, that you're carrying God within you, if the ego gets a hold of that, you become a narcissist and you act as if you're the only person who has divine inside you. And so the visitation is the realization that others too are God carriers. So I call it the Christian namaste, where you can recognize and honor the God in everybody else. And it becomes very important to realize that everybody else with whom you come in contact also volunteered to be a God carrier, to birth God into the planet. But they've forgotten, like you've forgotten, and like I've forgotten. Now, when you wake up to that realization, sometimes it begins slowly, and there's a sequence to it, that maybe you can recognize the divine in your soulmate. And then maybe later in other family members, even people you disagree with in the family. And then maybe among your friends, that they too are God carriers. But what happens when you can begin to make this realization that the stranger is a God carrier and the enemy is a God carrier and animals are God carriers and nature itself is a God carrier? Then at that stage, you're coming fully awake to the realization of the divine in everything. And I talked about the Magnificat, Mary saying, my soul magnifies the Lord. I told you the story about my father's motorbike that I set fire to with a magnifying glass, which was the lens that fell out of my grandmother's eyeglasses. And realizing that as a young child again, I couldn't make sense of Mary saying, my soul magnifies God. I couldn't understand, as a little boy of 7 or 8, how could Mary, even though she's the mother of Jesus, she's still a human being, how could she magnify God? Magnify means to make bigger. And then I realized that this tiny little lens, this focal point, you know, the sun, which was 93 million miles away and was lighting up the entire heliosphere, couldn't set fire to my father's motorbike until I put this piece of glass in between. And so Mary was saying, I'm God's lens, or I'm God's eyeglasses, or I'm God's magnifying glass. In order to set fire to planet Earth and to bring Christ consciousness, where God needs magnifying glasses. And every one of us is signed up to be magnifying glasses. We're here to set fire to the world, to bring in Christ consciousness and Mother Nature. So that was the kind of the visitation unpacking. The third one was the nativity, the birth of Jesus, historically. But it's true as well that when we read in the gospel, you must be compassionate as God is compassionate. We realize that in Aramaic, the word for compassion, rachamim, is the plural of the word for a womb. So we're being told you have to be womb-like, as the source of all the universe is womb-like. And that means birthing sequentially, birthing more and more divine versions of yourself until finally you become a fully enlightened being. So yeah, you firstly you'll identify with your body, and then maybe with your emotions, and then maybe with your thinking, and then maybe with relationships, and then maybe with the profession that you're in. But you're not done giving birth until you give birth to God yourself. So the nativity really is about the ongoing sequential birthing until finally you give birth to God in everything you do. That would be the kind of my unpacking of the nativity. The fourth one then would be the presentation in the temple. And there's the story again of the infant Jesus, 40 days old, being presented to God in the temple. It has to do with, some kind of initiation rites, like baptism for Catholics. And it has to do about, it's not about introducing the newborn child into some kind of a dogmatic tradition, but welcoming the neonate as the latest prophet in our midst, as God's latest form of revelation. That's what it is. We're welcoming the new prophets into our midst. And we're trying to align the little child with a particular wisdom tradition in order to teach the child how to incarnate God. That's the function of a community, or the function of the parents. It is to help the child to learn, how do you actually go about incarnating God in the world? That should be our job. Unfortunately, even the wisdom traditions themselves are fraught with cultural prejudices of various kinds. So very often, as we kind of induct our children into spiritual traditions, we marinate them in all kinds of prejudices also. And so it becomes really, really important then that, we're very, very careful about the communities into which we initiate our children. We have to find communities ourselves which challenge us in our journey and support us in our journey. So I suggested that there are 3 versions or 3 levels to this. Firstly, is developing a personal cosmology. How do you make sense out of the experiences of your unique life? Secondly, joining some kind of an intentional community, one that's helping you to grow and evolve. And then thirdly, some kind of regular disciplined spiritual practices. So that was how I unpacked the notion of the presentation in the temple. And the final mystery was the finding in the temple. The story, again in Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, where at age 12, Jesus remains in Jerusalem when his family went down for the feast of the Passover. And his parents spend 3 days trying to find him, and they can't find him. And finally, they come across him in the temple, where he's debating the scholars in the temple. And I suggested that in fact, is where we have to graft other wisdom traditions onto the spirituality with which we were raised. It becomes really, really important. That's the only way we can overcome the cultural prejudices that are attendant upon being born and initiated into just one wisdom tradition. We have to investigate other systems and graft them onto our own. And I suggested in that process, we have to become serial killers. We have to do 4 murders. I have to murder the ego, not in the sense that I abolish it, but in the sense that I teach it that it is a servant of the soul, not the master of the destiny. That we have to kill our father, which means our cultural tradition, not abandon it, but transcend it in a kind of an epigenetic fashion where all subsequent stages incorporate but go beyond the previous stages, in the same way in which a tree which is sending out branches and leaves and twigs is not abandoning its trunk or its root system. It's growing from that, but going beyond that. We have to kill our guru, that there is no teacher who can take us all the way. It's not that we outpass or outstrip our teachers sometimes, but that there are places we have to go on our own where the teacher cannot take us, is not allowed to take us, is not able to take us, because every single one of us is absolutely unique. We birth God in very unique ways. And there are some places where only you can go alone and the teacher cannot take you in that place. So we have to kill the teacher in that sense of the word. And then finally, we have to kill God, our theological constructs, the projections we make, this distant demanding deity whom we have fashioned in our scriptural traditions. We have to kill that. As Meister Eckhart said very famously, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. Or as Buddhists say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. So that's part of the finding in the temple, where we're grafting new wisdom traditions onto the existing ones. And I told you the story about my own well here, where I live. It's 260 feet down. It's my own water supply, and it's pristine water that comes from the Sierras. But as it comes through the geological strata where I live, it takes on a whole bunch of toxins. And so I have to do a filtration process before I can drink the water. And I suggested that that's a metaphor for the difference between spirituality and religion. That spirituality is the pristine, mystical waters that gives birth to all religions. But all religions add their own level of toxicity through this stratified, layers, geological layers of ritual and dogmatic assertion that we have to, in some senses, filter that out. And the best way to do it is to cross-fertilize it with other wisdom traditions and find out what do they all have in common. And what they all have in common is the pristine, real water. What they have as individuals are their cultural prejudices, and we have to let go of those. And I left you with a question at the end of last week, was to ask you, which traditions, which other wisdom traditions have you managed to graft on to the spirituality of your childhood, and how have they helped you grow and let go of the prejudices attendant upon the particular wisdom tradition into which you were initiated? So that's where I went with the last 2 weeks. So let's open it up now to Q&A.
As I spend time meditating, and there's never, I can't think of a better time how you phrase to be a magnifying glass to the world. I would say that these times are probably the most apropos times to do that. And I'm just going to be as real as I know how. And when I meditate and I pray for our quote unquote leaders, and I look at where they maybe have spent their 30 or 40 years in their political career and the policies in which they have wanted to birth. And when I look at some of those policies, they're not congruent with love. They're not congruent to anything that, in my opinion, that's just my opinion, I consider to be godlike or Christ-like. And so because I don't know these quote unquote leaders personally, I can only go on what they have stood on during their political career. That's the only way I can know who they are. Having said that, if that makes sense, sometimes I really struggle with seeing the God in them because of what I see them standing for years and years ad hominem. And so that's what I struggle with these days, is really seeing the God in some of these people that seem to not really stand for anything and that is Christ-like. So if that makes sense, that's kind of my question. What would you say to that?
Thanks, Trish. So obviously, I'm not going to get into party politics whatsoever. I have no interest in that. I don't have TV and I don't watch the news. But I certainly agree with you that our world is in a really sad state. And not just our own country, but all over the world. And this is, a kind of a rolling phenomenon. And it is why you and I and everybody present here this morning volunteered to be on planet Earth at this stage. We come in some senses, we're like troops on the beachhead in Normandy. We're coming in where the fighting is the heaviest, because that's when we most need to volunteer. So every one of us here is here by choice. So none of us is in a situation that we didn't expect to find. The ego is unaware of it. The incarnated being is unaware of it, but the soul is fully cognizant of the fact that this is when I volunteered. Now, having said that, when I look at the entire scope of human history, again and again and again, you find extraordinary souls coming into the world at times of crisis. If you look at what I call the rolling oligarchy, you look at world history and you look at how various empires have established themselves in various parts of the world, and it seems to be moving towards the West in a way. But people who were born into those eras suffered tremendously. They were killed and maimed and discriminated against. So beginning with maybe the Sumerian Empire about 4000 BCE, which was overthrown by the Assyrian Empire, which was overthrown by the Babylonians, which was overthrown by the Egyptians, then overthrown by the Persians, then overthrown by the Greeks, then by the Romans, then by the Spaniards, then by the English, and then we had our own American empire. So again and again and again, you get people born into situations where they're discriminated against and where they're subject to all kinds of villainy and all kinds of violence. So every soul that's come in the history of planet Earth has volunteered to come into situations in which they've experienced that level. And so as incarnated beings, they must think, why in God's name am I doing this? You're doing it because you volunteered to be here now. And the only way that you can change a situation like that is not engaging in the trenches, it is elevating a way above it. You can't solve any problem from the same mindset that created it. And so you can't fight fire with fire. And you can't fight fire by throwing gasoline on it in an attempt to quench it, because gasoline feels wet, but it just ignites further infernos. So the Yonis response to every situation in which we find ourselves is to elevate our thinking away above the fray, and to realize that everybody, those we love and those whom we have difficulties with, are all attempting to birth God, but they're all asleep at the wheel, as most of us are asleep at the wheel. So to the extent that I'm still operating out of anger, and to the extent that I'm still unable to recognize the God in other people, I myself am asleep at the wheel. If I were fully awake, I would recognize the God in others. That does not mean that I can't challenge them, because part of love is challenge. I believe there are 4 ways that Christ demonstrated love. I call them the 4 C's. The first form of love is confirmation. The attaboy, you're doing a great job, go for it. I love what you're doing. That's the first form, confirmation love. The second one is cooperation, where we're members on a team. We can't all do everything, so we're doing complementary things so that together we can accomplish the entire task. That's love as complementary. The third one is love as, compensation, where somebody drops the ball and you're part of the team, so you pick it up and you run with it anyway, so that your team still wins, in a sense. So compensation for the mistakes of others. And the fourth one is confrontation or challenge. You can love somebody by challenging them and confronting them, but you have to do it with a loving heart. And you have to do it by appealing and trying to identify the God in the other. You cannot accomplish, it cannot be loving if it's the God in you attempting to villainize or demonize, the other person. So again and again and again, as we love and as we try to kind of rectify the world in which we find ourselves and move the entire world into Christ consciousness, if it's not coming from an awakened heart, filled with love and filled with compassion and forgiveness and trust and wisdom and love, if it's not coming from that place, we're just adding to the conflict. So what we're all experiencing right now is a further wake-up call. We're being told, to the extent that I'm anxious, or to the extent that I'm angry, or to the extent that I'm fearful, I am still not fully awake. And to the extent that, I villainize anybody else, I am still not awake to the divine in them. If I want to awaken the divine in them, I am not going to do it by getting angry at them.
I took a class at ITP with COJ members, and there was a keto teacher who said, center is a place we pass through. We're not always centered. So these luminous moments of awakening in our life, that we have that are so powerful, that as I get older, and especially now, I realize it's work to try and stay in that place. It's just more and more work all the time to try and stay there. So it's constant.
It is constant. And so in some senses, our center of gravity is oscillates. There's a belief system, for instance, that there's a line from service to self to service to other. That incarnation has lived somewhere along that line. And we have to start off life, at this service to self end of it. A little infant will not survive infancy if it's not totally narcissistic. It wants nonstop. It wants to be fed, wants to be held, wants to be cuddled, wants to be attended to. So we need to be a radical narcissist as we begin life. It's totally about service to self. But as we grow, we need to start moving along that spectrum to service towards others, compassion, understanding. And when we cross the 50% line, we're at the beginning of enlightenment. But it's not that we're on this constant movement, this single trajectory, this unfailing graph. It's that we tend to oscillate around the center of gravity. So maybe by age 7, where we've moved a little bit away from the narcissism, because now we've been taught rules and roles. We realize we're members of a family and that we have a role in the family and that there are rules in the family. And so we're moving now to service towards the family. But we're still oscillating between the narcissist and the 7-year-old. So the center of gravity is moving in that arena. Between 7 and 12, we move into the kind of a self-reflective stage. By age 12, we're realizing that our culture is not all it was cracked up to be, or our religion is not all that it was cracked up to be, or our family is not all that's cracked up to be. There's a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of hidden secrets, perhaps, in the culture or whatever, things we're doing elsewhere. And so now the center of gravity begins to oscillate, between egocentricity and ethnocentricity, and now into what I would call ecocentricity, where we're aware of the whole planet. So from 7 to 12, we're oscillating at a different part of this spectrum, but we're going backwards and forwards. And in particular relationships or particular circumstances, we can regress completely. But at some stage we move into the realization we become cosmocentric beings. We realize that we're God stuff, literally God stuff, and that everybody else is as well. And so we can look at every situation from a multi-perspectival aspect, that there is not just one perspective on an issue. Everybody has a radically different perspective. In Ireland today, it was called the All-Ireland Hurling Final. I have no idea who won it. I haven't been onto Irish TV or Irish newspapers. And so it's Waterford and Limerick are playing in the equivalent of like the World Series. And there's going to be thousands and hundreds of thousands of people all over the country watching this game. And Limerick people are going to see it from their perspective, and they're going to be really angry with the referee in some instances. And the Waterford people are going to see the same event and come from a totally different perspective. So there are as many perspectives on life as there are sentient beings in the cosmos. Every sentient being is a perspective on life in the cosmos. And in that sense, God, through incarnation, is having all of these perspectives. God is seeing the cosmos through the eyes of every sentient being. Now, that's what enlightenment is about. It is moving from my own very narrow, focused perspective into understanding the perspectives of other people. It does not necessarily mean that I have to agree with them, but I have to understand them. I have a rule when I'm working with couples in couples counseling, and they come in with an issue, and the wife is there because she wants me to fix the husband. And the husband is there because he wants me to fix the wife. And what I start off with, I tell each one, I want you for 5 minutes, tell me, what are you as an individual contributing to this relationship by way of building it and by way of making it difficult? Tell me what your strengths and your weaknesses are in this relation. Not his, not hers, but yours. And then go to the other party and tell them, for 5 minutes, you tell me what you're contributing positively and negatively to this relationship. And we start then by acknowledging our own piece and by trying to see the other piece. And I have a rule with communication where I tell them, now I want you for 3 minutes to listen to what your partner has to say. Not just formulating the first objection you're going to come up with, or not formulating the retort, but really listening. And you can't respond to that person until you can repeat precisely what they said and check out with them. Is that what you meant? Is that what you said? And is that what you meant? And if you got it correct, that you heard what they said and you understood what they meant by what they said, then you can make a response to it. So that's what it means to have multi-perspectival. So that's the journey of incarnation. Our center of gravity is going to oscillate in every relationship and in different circumstances between service to others and service to self. But hopefully, over the course of our incarnation, we're going to spend more and more time beyond the 50% mark, where we're in service to self and in service to the cosmos itself. But in any one instance, there'll be a hair trigger reaction to go right back down to my perspective and my narcissistic and my egoic viewpoint. We have to keep catching ourselves and bring ourselves back up again.
It's sort of a paradox that to become more awake in the end, we have to circle back and pay attention to ourselves and make sure that we're operating from, because you can go out and be in the world or whatever, but at some point you have to really look at how you look back at yourself and what we're doing, as you said.
The only person I can change is me. I have the ability and the responsibility to change me. I don't have the ability or the right to change you. So all I can do is acknowledge what it feels like to me, what this relationship feels like. And when you do X, here's what I feel. But I'm not making a response to what I feel. I'm just saying, here's a trigger for me. And if you love me, you maybe want to become aware of the things that trigger me. But ultimately, I am 100% responsible for my own reactions in every situation. And I'm the only person I can change or have the responsibility. I have no right and no ability to change you.
Thank you.
So you touched on this a little bit already, but I'm wondering if you could speak to how would you tell someone who feels victimized by their life that they chose to incarnate? And how would you speak from the soul about why people are born into slavery or extremely dark and abusive circumstances? And this question came about because I was talking with my mother the other night around the dinner table, and you know, I said I chose to incarnate, and I believe that that is to be true. As I've come into greater alignment with my own soul, I can see that. But she said, well, that's very easy for you to say because you know, or she says, it sounds like something that's easy for you to say because I've had a good family and I've had but I've also gone through complete hell to come to where I am today. But I didn't really have an answer, and my intention was never to sound righteous about it. I just want to speak. I want to be able to talk about this also in a way that's helpful.
Beautiful. Great. Two great questions, Hannah. So here is where it becomes really important to have a cosmology which is adequate to explaining the circumstances of our lives. So most of us put us in a situation and we're going to make a response, either verbally or kind of in action. And if I say to you, Hannah, why did you say that? You say, I felt like the right thing to say. But unfortunately, for the vast bulk of us, the cosmology that drives our thinking, our speaking, and our behaving is a cosmology that has been unconsciously acquired from our culture of origin and is unconsciously accessed in any one situation. So we're not really free. We're not really thinking through. We're kind of basing our responses, our reactions, our knee-jerk reactions on the basis of a cosmology over which we had no control initially, and which is, driving us now again without our being fully aware of it. So that's why I say it becomes really, really important to create a cosmology for yourself that can explain all of your unique experiences in this lifetime. So that's the first thing I would say. That cosmology then has to be able to accommodate the kinds of questions that you're asking. So what of victimhood or victimization? Or what about being born into a healthy family while there are other people literally born into slavery? That is where a cosmology that suggests that we only live once is radically inaccurate and radically unhelpful. To believe that a little baby who dies at age 3 months and is given the thumbs up by God come to heaven because the child was baptized but never had the opportunity to commit sin. And there's somebody in their 70s or 80s, who went out, celebrating a birthday and got drunk and got killed by a car crossing the street and they go down to hell. So does that cosmology make sense, or does that sound like justice? It doesn't, of course. So we have to come to a cosmology that can really explain the kinds of questions you're raising. And for me, that cosmology necessarily involves a notion of reincarnation, that the soul has many, 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 many trips to planet Earth. I've used this example before of a chess game. When you're playing a game of chess, there are 10 to the power of 123 possible moves that can be made on a chessboard during a chess game. 10 to the power of 123. That's trillions and trillions and trillions of possible moves. But in any one chess game, you're only going to move about 80 times. So if you play one game of chess and you make 80 moves, you're not going to become a chess master. You have to go back again and again and again and try different configurations. And that's why reincarnation is so important. Otherwise, we cannot explain the kind of situations and the kinds of questions you have. If you believe that every soul gets as many opportunities in as many configurations as possible. When we incarnate, we have to decide on a gender, on a race, on a skin color, on a socioeconomic status, on a religious affiliation. And so we're locked into that little configuration for 70, 80, 90 years. And we think that's a life experience. It is a life experience, but it's not life experience. It's totally inadequate. So we come back again and again and again with different configurations. Sometimes being born different skin color, different gender, different ethnicity, different religious affiliation, different socioeconomic status, until we have plumbed the depths of incarnation and understood what it's like to find ourselves in all these various guises and still respond in love. So it gets even more complicated. Because I believe that reincarnation is not so much a chronological phenomenon as it is a simultaneous phenomenon, that we're living all of these lives simultaneously. It's not that, I think, for instance, that after this life as Seán, when this one ends in the 21st century, my next incarnation that I'm aware of could be in the 13th century in North Africa as a slave. Chronology doesn't make the slightest difference. I saw this one time, the first time somebody gave me a CD of music that I could play on my computer, a disc. And I put it into my computer and I clicked on the icon and it showed me there were 13 tracks. And I hit the play button and I went from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And it says, here's the name of the song, here's how long it lasts, 4 minutes, 16 seconds, whatever. And then I saw another button and I pushed that and it scrambled the order. You understand? It just randomized the order which they played. And then, being a mathematician, I decided I could create my own order. And so I decided to do the prime numbers first. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. And then put the other ones in. And then I thought, what if there were a button that I could press in which all the tracks play simultaneously? What would happen then? Now, that's the realization that I have of incarnation. All the tracks are playing simultaneously. But as I said a few weeks ago in answer to a question, you can only be aware as the actor in each incarnation of the role you're playing. I gave the example of, somebody like Tom Hanks playing, a whole bunch of different movies. And if I were to put on, a show in Palo Alto where a different movie of Tom Hanks is playing on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, they're all playing simultaneously. None of the characters he's playing are aware of the other movies or the other characters he's portraying. But Tom Hanks is aware of all the roles he's playing. And the soul is aware of all the roles it's playing simultaneously. Although the individual egos, as Seán, I don't have access right now to other roles my soul is playing in other incarnations and other configurations. But I'm playing all of those. And from all of those, I'm generating experiences and perspectives and learning what it's like to be a human on planet Earth. And I'm trying to cross-fertilize all of those pieces. And so the idea then of being a victim, I'm only a victim to the extent that I identify with a particular role in a particular incarnation, and I buy a particular story that I believe is true. For years and years and years in my office in Los Altos, where I was counseling, I was threatening to put a sign up on the door, a sign that said, change the bloody story. Because people come in again and again, and they're addicted to their stories. And I want to say, change the story. Go back to your childhood. Trawl your childhood for different events. You don't have to make them up. But depending on the selection you make, it's going to create your self-perception. Because there's a soul self, there's an experiencing self, and there's a narrative self. The soul self is who you really, really, really are. The experiencing self is the part of you that's having all of these experiences, and the narrative self is the part of you that's selecting out a non-representative sample of what you actually experienced and creating your identity around that piece. And the difference between the mystics and the rest of us, most of us identify with the narrating self, and the mystics identify with the soul self. So that's where victimhood comes from. Victimhood comes from taking a non-representative sample of experiences and creating my identity around that. Great question, Hannah.
My next question has to do with, it's sort of, the prayer that you had when you were a child. And is it your perception today that there is a presence of satanic or Luciferian forces working in this earth? And if that is your belief, how do you perceive what is of the light and what is of that? And how do you train yourself to recognize that with compassion and love? And I guess that's, do you understand?
Yeah. 11 questions in one, okay. The first question you asked is the oldest and most difficult problem in theology. It's called Theodicy, the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen? It's called Theodicy. And I've thought a lot about this, obviously, over the years. And I have many, many different ways of approaching it. The first way is the one I just mentioned, service to self versus service to others. That a lot of evil happens because we're at the service to self end of the spectrum throughout our entire lives. That's one source of evil. A second source of evil is the notion of projection, where instead of admitting our own particular personal darkness, we project it onto somebody else in an interpersonal relationship. Or we do it, as communities where we project our stuff onto other cultures. Or we do it as a nation where we project our stuff onto another nation. Or we do it as a species where we project our stuff onto other life forms, animals or plant life or whatever. And so projection is a mechanism where we fail to recognize the shadow in ourselves, individually, communally, nationally, whatever, and we project it on some other group. And that unrecognized shadow constellates. I used an image one time. There's a place in the Pacific Ocean called the North Pacific Garbage Patch. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's an island of plastics, which is bigger than Texas, if you're listening, Trish. And it's all the rubbish that's dumped at sea, and it's dumped off the west coast of America and the east coast of Asia. And because of the gyroscopic nature of the tides, it's formulating this huge big garbage patch there. And fish are eating it, dying from it, and we're eating the fish. So we're recycling our own garbage, literally. Now, that's what happens when you project individual and communal shadow material. It constellates. It creates literally a cancerous tumor in the atmosphere of the planet, in the energetic atmosphere of the planet. And all of us are plugged into that. We're all affected by it. And so that cancerous tumor is affecting us mentally. A lot of people right now, I'm doing a lot of counseling with people who are really, really anxious right now, who are having really upsetting dreams, who are waking up in the morning feeling really depressed and fearful. And it's because we're plugged into this giant tumor that we've created by refusing to accept our own shadow material. And there's a fourth element to it. And the fourth element is that there are life forms out there that are much more advanced than we, much more advanced, technologically and intellectually, but not necessarily spiritually or morally. And I really believe that there are forces out there who think that planet Earth is a plaything, and they're feeding energetically off the distress occasioned by warfare or internecine disputes or greediness or whatever, in the same way that at this stage of my life, I cannot countenance how two guys can get into a boxing ring and beat the crap out of each other while 5,000 people say, yeah, get him, kill him, kill him. Or how we can put animals fighting against each other, whether it's roosters or dogs or whatever, and get off on it energetically. Now, if that's true of us as a human species, I believe it's true also of these other entities, that they're literally using planet Earth as a plaything. And St. Paul actually mentions this, I think, in his letter to the Galatians, where he says, our struggle is not just against beings of flesh, but in the powers of the heaven, the powers of the sky. So this is why we need protection from avatars and angelic beings, and why I recommend, as a little child growing up in Ireland, and I still do the practice every night before I go to bed, we were taught, before you go to sleep at night, you say, Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this night be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. Amen. And the same when you wake up in the morning, you say the same thing, which is ever this day. So it's like you're bookending your day with beings of light surrounding you. And particularly if you're dreaming at night. When you're dreaming at night, you're leaving your physical body, you're leaving your energy body, and you're moving in your astral body. And you're moving through the astral realms. And the astral realms have two kind of subdivisions, the lower astral and the higher astral. The lower astral is populated by discombobulated entities, earthlings who've died and don't realize they're dead or are addicted to the planet, and are hovering. And then the upper level of the astral is light beings. So it becomes very important that you navigate with protection through that. So when I go into sleep at night, one of the last prayers I say is, I now commit myself, I want to travel in the astral realms, visiting with light beings and avatars who will teach me and heal me. And I offer to be of assistance to any discombobulated entity that's suffering and lost, according to my ability level. According to my ability level. Do not get me into stuff I can't handle. And so I want to protect myself for the journey. The image I have is like, if you travel from planet Earth out into our solar system, and you pass Mars, which is the next one out, and then you get to Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. There's a place in between Mars and Jupiter called the asteroid belt. It's the result of a planet that exploded billions of years ago. And there's a whole area of debris. And as you're traveling through that, it's a minefield. If you send a satellite through that and it gets struck by a rock, it'll disintegrate. When you're traveling at night in your dreams, you're traveling in an astral realm where you're going through literally a minefield at one stage and have to be really, really protected. So yes, in answer to your question, I do believe that there are several sources of darkness, one of them being, in a sense, beyond our control. And therefore we need light beings to protect our planet and ourselves as we engage with this stage of world transformation.
As you talk about incarnation, and it could be in various centuries, and it could all be simultaneous, I'm wondering what's happening to my soul.
Yes.
You're not cutting it up, are you? I mean,
No, no. But the thing is, the soul is infinite. The soul is a holographic fractal of source. And we just unpack those two words. A hologram is an entity, every part of which contains the totality. So if you take a hologram, a photograph, you've seen these, they look like they're three-dimensional. You know those, Teresa? Holographic photograph. If you cut off a corner of that tiny little corner, all the data on the original photograph are contained in the corner. And so that's what it means, hologram. And a fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So you take the pattern of, for instance, an atom. So you've got a nucleus and you've got electrons spinning around it. That's one level, one scale of the pattern. You come up to a planet, and now you've got a planet with moons circling around it. That's the second level. Now you get up to a solar system, and you get a sun and planets spinning around that. Then you get up to a galaxy, and you get a black hole at the center of the galaxy, and all of the solar systems circling about it. You take the galaxies, and the galaxies are circling around a cosmic black hole in space. And so you got this pattern, this fractal. So the soul is a holographic fractal of God, which means that the totality is contained in all of it. And therefore, when the soul itself, manifests itself in several simultaneous incarnations, each of those as well is a holographic fractal. And so the totality of the soul is present to each of the incarnations. You're not slicing it up and operating on half power.
Hey, I just wanted to give two things to the two questions you answered about the soul. The analogy I love to use is the one of the octopus. And if anyone has seen my octopus teacher, right, the octopus in the total body stays up, connected to source. And each of the tentacles that come down as our incarnation or fractal, as you say, is a part of the whole. And if you know anything about octopus, I won't go into it. Each tentacle is the totality, yet individualized. And everything the tentacle feels, the other ones feel, and the body feels, right? So check out octopus as a great visual metaphor of what we are, frankly. And then the second one is I put this in the chat for Lawrence to include. There's an amazing new movie that's coming out next year called The 9 Lives. And this guy sits in a little cabin looking at all the humans, and he gets to decide and interview which soul comes in to replace someone that's departing.
Brilliant.
And so the description is in there. It's coming out next year. And it's kind of like the Soul movie from Pixar that is releasing on December 25th, Christmas Day, on the Disney Channel. Right. So people can check that out. Anyway.
That's great, Ravelin.
Blessings.
What you said about the octopus reminds me about one of the most powerful spiritual experiences of my life was in January of 2006, where I had a friend of mine who was also a clinical psychologist, regress me into what's called life between lives. So I wanted to experience what happens at the end of an incarnation before another incarnation begins. Where do we spend that time and what is it like? And it was a really it was a 4-hour session, which I tape recorded and have listened to and taken notes on and meditated for years on. But one of the experiences of that was when I was ready to reincarnate, I found myself in what I call the launching pad. And there were literally millions of souls also getting ready to parachute into various levels of incarnation, not just on planet Earth, but on other planets and in non-physical dimensions. And what happened was there was a coordinator in that room, some kind of an angelic being. And it was fascinating to me that every time any one of us had a question, it's like the question immediately became available to every one of us, like the octopus and his tentacles. And the angelic being who answered the question, the information immediately went to every single one of us. So there was no thought that anybody had and no response that we received that wasn't instantaneously available to everybody in that launching pad before we parachuted into incarnation.
So, Father Seán, can I blame you for having come back this time? Because I saw you in Grand Central Station and you're like going to Earth, and I'm like, nope, I'm not going. And you're like, come on, Fernandez, you got eternity. What the hell's another lifetime? So thanks, right? You're to blame. Appreciate it.
Mea culpa, maxima culpa. That was to teach you forgiveness, Robin.
Well, thank you. Like Starman said, ice cream on pie is not too bad this time. Okay.
So it's my sense in the things that you've said and the things that I've read that you've written, that evil is not something that emanates in any way from God, that it's all created by creatures of various kinds through, I guess, simultaneous realities, since we think there's no time. I have experience with that. I mean, I've had it in kind of meditative and dream states where I can actually see personally where I have been part of creating my hell. And it's quite a profound experience to see that, because when you are in it, it looks like everyone else is doing it.
Yes.
But it's not at all that. So even higher beings, I think, must be at some level able to depart from the path as well. So it's not just humans, but it's higher beings as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Because the more advanced beings are, the more free will is available to them. And there's the instantaneous manifestation of the thoughts that they have. On planet Earth, there's a kind of a time buffer built in to us, so that when we have, evil thoughts, or, before we can act out, and then we get, 10 seconds out before they can manifest. I've used this example before. If I'm driving down the freeway and somebody cuts me off, and I stick my middle finger out the window and say, I'm going to kill you. Now, if that translated into immediate manifestation, the entire freeway would be littered with dead bodies. Every time somebody got irate at another motorist and said, I'm going to kill you, we'd be littered with dead bodies. So there's a time buffer built in on planet Earth so that we can't execute our thinking immediately. Now, if we keep coming back to stuff again and again and again, eventually it will manifest at some stage of this life. And certainly, if not now, in a future incarnation. But as we move up the ladder, we look at more and more enlightened beings, angelic beings or whatever, there isn't a time buffer. And so a free will thought about greed or selfishness immediately translates into an outcome. So it's not that these guys have it easier because they're more enlightened. In some senses, they're less likely to do it, but they have more firepower if they choose to do it. It's the difference between two cavemen fighting with cudgels, and two nations sending intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other. The same anger, but the weaponry is very, very different. And so you're absolutely right. None of this comes from God. And in some writings I've done, I've used different metaphors. So upstairs in my room here, I have a painting called The Touch of the Master's Hand. Do you know that? It's the story of an auction where somebody is auctioning off a whole bunch of stuff. And there's a fiddle, a violin, and he picks it up and he says, here's a fiddle, out of my bid. $2, $3, $3 going once, twice. And then an old man comes up, puts his hand up and says, can I catch it for a minute? And the old man comes up, and he takes the fiddle and he starts playing. And it's just ecstatic. The whole audience is absolutely rapt. It's called The Touch of the Master's Hand. And the old man gives it back and leaves. And the auctioneer pulls it up and says, what am I bid? 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, 5,000 going once, twice. And so in a sense, every instrument is built for music, really great music. But some people are just going to scratch on it. And some people are going to create, extraordinary mystical sounds from it. So God creates souls capable of extraordinary symphonic, behavior. But some of us are just going to scratch out a tune. Another example I've used is, you took it the great, you're an artist, Karen. Some of the great artists of the Renaissance, like a Fra Angelico, what they did on a piece of canvas is extraordinary. I'm sure there were a lot of other painters who had the same pigments and the same canvas and the same brushes available to them, and they created just, stick drawings. So it's not the canvas per se or the paint per se that creates the portrait, it's the artistry behind it. Another example I've used is, when you're assembling a jigsaw, and you're not paying attention and you're putting the wrong pieces in the wrong places, and you wind up with a jumbled jigsaw that's like pieces sticking up and there's 40 pieces left over. It's not that the jigsaw was designed to create that, a mess on the table. It was designed to create the picture on the box. It was the way you worked it that created the mess on the box. So that's what it's like, when we experience evil at various levels. The evil has to come from the way in which we play the instruments or assemble the jigsaw puzzles or doing the painting. They're not inherent to the medium itself. And so any kind of messing of the situation has to do with the free will of the souls, as God's great gift to us.
So it seems like that would be the final or the ultimate phase of God experiencing.
Yes, exactly.
It's imminent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so just a final note on that, when you think about it, the ultimate version of that is the belief system in Lucifer. Lucifer, conflated with Satan. Lucifer in Latin literally means light carrier. And the story behind it was that Lucifer was a very, very advanced being, but that when human beings were created, he was jealous that, God gave them souls and refused to serve God, and so led a rebellion. Now, whether there's any value to that or it's just a myth, but it certainly represents the truth that, advancement intellectually and even spiritually sometimes is not a guarantee of right action always. And that's, I think, when I think back now to that story of my childhood at age 4, I think what my soul was praying for was that Satan also would wake up and realize that the greatest glory of all is acknowledging God. And when I said, let the devil back into heaven, maybe that's what my soul was praying for. Let the devil too wake up and realize that he's a carrier of light. He's a bite-sized piece of God. He was meant to birth God as well. And instead of that, he birthed simply an ego.